and have it start. Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Tel Aviv tour, the second tour that we're doing with Tomer. So for all of you who joined us last week, we really hope that you enjoyed the Trail of Independence. Today, Tomer will take us to a feminist tour in Tel Aviv, the White City Ladies. For all of you who weren't here last week, Tomer Shlush is a Tel Aviv expert guiding walking tours since 2008. A descendant of one of the founding families of Tel Aviv, Tomer has a unique perspective of the city history. Combining history, culture, and architecture, Tomer's tours are a great source of knowledge as well as a fun way to get to know a place. Tours guided by Tomer are labeled TLVXP, Tel Aviv Explained by a Tel Aviv Expert. Please feel free to send your questions for Tomer in the chat during the presentation, and he will answer them at the end. Thank you so much, Tomer, for being here today with us. Go ahead.
Thank you for having me. Such a lovely introduction. Thanks again, guys, for coming in. So nice to see such a big group that wants to come and visit Tel Aviv. So we can't do it now physically, so we're doing it virtually. As they mentioned, this is the second tour in our series. The last one, the previous one, was in the Trail of Independence along Rothschild Boulevard. And today we're going to do a themed tour that is going to follow the footsteps of prominent women in the history of Tel Aviv. And as they mentioned, you can also send questions as I'm talking through the chat box. And I see that we already have one. Miriam is asking about my email address. So no worries, I'll give it to you at the end of this session, so you'll be able to contact me. And another thing that I wanted to share with you before we start our tour is my website. So I'm gonna share my screen. My tour guiding business is labeled TLVXP, Tel Aviv Explained by a Tel Aviv Expert. And when you click the English section, you'll be able to see right at the top the virtual tours that you can access by yourselves, which are 360 panoramic tours that you are supposed to now see on your screen as I'm sharing it. Just nod your heads if you can. That gives me a good sign that you're seeing what I'm seeing. Thank you. So you got the Trail of Independence that we already did together. There's also the recording on the BZD Facebook page, another interesting tour in the Gan Hashmal neighborhood. And what we're going to do today is this tour, the Feminist virtual tour in Tel Aviv, that you will be able to access by yourself and feel like you are in Tel Aviv in a 360 panoramic tour. So this is on my website. Once you click this link, the virtual tour link, you'll be able to see it on the big screen, and you'll be able to take your mouse and shift the image and turn it all around, left, right, up, down, and also click on those augmented reality clicks to see some more information and enjoy the tour, just as you can enjoy the tour that we're doing live right now. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and see that we already have questions. You went too fast for me. What my website, Miriam, is TLVXP. Thank you for asking, tlvxp.com. And Sharon is asking, why was the name for this tour White City Ladies? The reason is that we're going to visit a place in Tel Aviv that is dubbed the White City. So we'll be able to see it and we'll understand its connection to prominent women in Tel Aviv. And let's start. Let's start with our first destination. It's actually not far from the place that we are seeing right now behind me, which is smack in the middle of Tel Aviv. That's Dizengoff Square. So not from here is going to be our first stop. Our first stop is going to be in what is now called the Dov Hoz Community Center. This is a very important place in Tel Aviv for me, because this is where I also took my kid when he was just born to go and visit the playground there. But apart from that, it is also of historic value, because in the 1930s it was built by a very important woman that you might know. She was born in Eastern Europe. Her family wasn't Zionist, so she went to the States at the time. It was the end of the 19th century. And over there, she travels between New York and Seattle, and eventually she settles in New York, where in 1919, she meets a cool guy that we talked about in our last tour. He had a beautiful hairdo. He was David Ben-Gurion. She hears him in one of his lectures talking about Zionism, and she becomes a Zionist. She falls in love with the notion of starting a new Jewish state starting a new Jewish state in the land of Israel. She becomes a Zionist, and she starts to become an important public figure. She puts up different organizations that are getting money from people and sending them to Israel, to the land of Israel. And one of the things that she did in 1935, she makes Aliyah. She comes to the land of Israel to oversee the construction of this building. So maybe some of you thought about a woman that was born in Eastern Europe, moved to the States, became Zionist, started up organizations. Maybe some of you are thinking about a certain person. You can write in the chat box if you have ideas about who this person might be. And in a second, I'm going to share my screen again to show you a photograph of the woman who put up the building that you see behind me, which is now the Dov Hoz Community Center. Her name was Bessie Gottesfeld. Betty Gottesfeld is the woman that I'm talking about. So maybe some of you thought maybe I was referring to another important woman that was born in Eastern Europe, came to the States, became Zionist, maybe Golda Meir, maybe Henrietta Szold, but actually Bessie Gottesfeld is one of the less known ones, and we are going to correct this situation in this tour. We're going to rediscover some of the important women who made their contribution to Israel and pre-state Israel. So Bessie Gottesfeld is one of them, because she started up an organization that was called the American Women's of Mizrahi Movement. She was a religious Jew, and she started up kind of the feminist or the women's faction of the Mizrahi movement. That was the religious Zionist movement. And she comes to the land of Israel in 1935 to construct the building that is now located behind me. That was back at the time a place for young religious women to become Israelis, to come to Israel, to have a place to stay, to work, to study, and to become pioneers in the land of Israel. It was called Bet Tzirot Mizrahi, the house of the young women of the Mizrahi movement. Hebrew is always so much shorter than the English version, right? So this was Bet Tzirot Mizrach. It was the second one that was constructed in the land of Israel, thanks to Bessie Gottesfeld, one of the prominent women who helped in the formation of the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel back in the 1930s. I'm also gonna skip a little bit ahead, so you'll be able to understand a little bit more about the place that we're visiting now. Bet Tzirot Mizrahi, that was kind of a school or a place for young students, young women to live in and work together and cook together and study together. Kind of a boarding house. You can see kind of a postcard from Tel Aviv in the 1950s, and you can see here Bet Tzirot Mizrahi, and you can also see the kind of girls who went to this institution. By the long sleeves and the long skirts that you see, you can understand that they were religious, which is interesting, because back then in pre-state Israel and also in the 1950s and 60s, Tel Aviv was more mixed in the sense that it had a very big group of people that were religious. It was not the secular ethos that Tel Aviv has now. But anyway, what happened to this building is that later it was abandoned, and it came to look this way. You can see that this abandoned building in 2011 was the place for demonstration by what was then known as the social protest in Israel. It was the Israeli version of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So people, young Israelis, went into this building that was abandoned for several years, and they demanded that it will become public property or a place for young people to live in. And eventually what happened is what you see behind me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which is the Dov Hoz Community Center. Unfortunately, Bessie Godesfeld isn't mentioned in any place in the new community center. And that's a shame, because she deserves it. She was an important woman, an important leader within the Zionist movement, but for reasons unknown to me, she's not mentioned in this place. I'm looking at the chat to see that I haven't missed any questions. Okay, everything looks correct. So this was our first place to mention Bessie Godesfeld. We're also going to mention some more interesting women that history for some reason forgotten. And now we're going to virtually walk from Dov Hoz Community Center along Dov Hoz Street to our next stop, which is going to be this house that you can now see behind me. On it's my left, but you might be able to understand better seeing that it is above this shoulder of mine. This house used to belong to Chana Rovina. And there's also a sign about right next to this shoulder of mine, sign here in the street that says that Chana Rovina lived here. This is actually very unique because a lot of the prominent people within the heart of Tel Aviv, actors, stage artists, producers, filmmakers, writers, poets, a lot of the prominent thinkers in Hebrew culture were commemorated in such signs that were put on the buildings that they lived in. But Chana Rovina, for some reason, got the sign right next to the building, but not on the building. We'll talk about it shortly. But who was Chana Rovina? Let's see. I'm going to share my screen again to show you a photograph of Chana. So you see Chana Rovina here as the most important actress in Habima Theater. Habima Theater started in Moscow, in what was then the Soviet Union, in 1919. It was the first Hebrew theater in modern times. In the 1920s, the Habima Theater moves to the land of Israel, and Chana Rovina moves with the theater, and she becomes the most important celebrity in Tel Aviv of the time. We would be able to compare her to, I don't know, today she would be like the Beyonce of Tel Aviv of the 1930s. That's how famous she was. And the newspapers at the time were also following an interesting love affair between her and the famous poet Alexander Penn. So you would be able to go to a coffee place in Tel Aviv in the 1930s, and you would look through the papers of the time, and you would read columns, gossip columns about Chana Rovina and Alexander Penn daily. That's how they were the Beyonce and Jay-Z of Tel Aviv in the 1930s. That's how celebrated they were. So she was the first lady of the theater, as was mentioned. And we also mentioned that the sign that is commemorating Chana Rovina is not on the building itself, but on the pavement next to the building. Why is that? Well, in Tel Aviv, this plaque positioning is conditioned by the agreement of the owner of the building. So in this case, in this building, the owners did not allow for the city to put up a plaque commemorating Chana Rovina, and rumor has it that he was unapproving of the relationship between them, between Chana Rovina and Alexander Pon, because they weren't married and they had a child out of wedlock. So he was kind of furious about that. There is also another explanation that I was told about, that she didn't pay the Vadabite, the money for keeping up the building. So the owner wanted to, you know, do something in spite. So this was Chana Rovina, but not far from this house, actually within a 2-minute walk, we'll be able to visit some more interesting characters who contributed to the renewal of Hebrew culture in the land of Israel. For example, 2 houses away from Chana Rovina's house, we will see the house of Yafa Yerkoni. She was celebrated as the war singer in 1948 when the War of Independence in Israel broke out. She was out there in the field singing to soldiers who were drafted to fight the first battles of the state of Israel, of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. She had a career of over 6 decades in which she became synonymous with Israeli singing. And also not far from there is this important figure. This is Gertrude Kraus. She was a woman that was born in Germany. She studied dance and became a choreographer. When she moved from Nazi Germany to the land of Israel, she also brings to pre-state Israel modern dancing. She becomes a famous choreographer, and she also taught Yafa Yerkoni. Yafa Yerkoni was a dancer before she became a singer. And also not far from the place that we're standing on Dov Hoz and Gordon Street, on this intersection, we will see the house of Leah Goldberg. Leah Goldberg is now known as the most famous children writer. She wrote a lot of stories for children, and a lot of songs by Leah Goldberg were also made into songs. A lot of poems were made into songs, and she's now celebrated as one of the most important women poets that were in Hebrew in modern times. And all of the women that I told you about, Chana Rovina and Yafa Yerkoni, Gertrude Kraus, and Leah Goldberg, they were all recipients of the Israel Prize. So Chana Rovina got an Israel Prize for theater, Yafa Yerkoni for singing, Gertrude Kraus for choreography, and Leah Goldberg for literature, which is amazing to think that 4 Israel Prize laureates, which is the Israeli equivalent or the local equivalent of the Nobel Prize, they all lived in this vicinity, in this area, so close to each other. That shows you that Tel Aviv, from the 1930s up until the 60s, and to some extent until today, is the locus of Hebrew culture in Israel. Okay, so this was our second stop, seeing the Israel Prize laureates next to the house of Chana Rovina, the first women of Hebrew theater. And we are now going to walk, you see behind me, this is Gordon Street. We're going to walk virtually until the next intersection and turn right on Dizengoff Street to get to the place that is now the belly button of Tel Aviv. That is the Dizengoff Square. I'm going to do my Houdini trick so you'll be able to see it even better. You see it from a top. Wow, this is amazing, right? So this is Dizengoff Square. Actually, in Hebrew, we use the word square for circus. So that's why you're seeing a circle and I'm saying square, and you might be thinking, well, Tomer doesn't know his geometry. It's just because something gets lost in translation in Hebrew. So this is Dizengoff. This should have been Dizengoff Circus, but we call it Dizengoff Square. And it was inaugurated in 1938 in the middle of Tel Aviv. the major street that is basically dissecting the square is called Dizengoff Street. The street was named after Mayor Dizengoff, the first mayor of Tel Aviv. We talked about him in our previous tour. And the square or the circus was named after Tzina Dizengoff, the wife of the first mayor of Tel Aviv. And Mayor Dizengoff made sure that this is what will happen. And this is how Mayor Dizengoff and Tzina Dizengoff will never separate anymore. The street is dissecting the square, so they are going to be together for eternity. It is interesting that the man, Mayor Dizengoff, he got the straight line, the street, while Tzina Dizengoff got the circle. This is interesting, you know, because it's symbolic of a man and a woman. So Dizengoff Square, I wanted to show you how it looked in its early days. You are now seeing on your screen Dizengoff Square in 1938 when it was first opened to the public. It was the pride of Tel Aviv in its early days. And amazingly, it was one of the first places in Tel Aviv to be named after a woman. And for quite a while, almost the only one. We're going to talk about it soon. So this is Dizengoff Square, and it is the most feminist place in Tel Aviv because it was not only named after a woman, it was also designed by a woman. So on your left, you're seeing Tzina Dizengoff. She's well dressed, as you can see, in the latest fashion of the time. This is the first woman of Tel Aviv, the first lady of Tel Aviv. That is Mrs. Tzina Dizengoff on your left, and the square was named after her. And the woman who designed it is called Genia Averbuch. You see her on your right. She was one of a handful of women architects who came to Tel Aviv in the 1930s when it was going through a building boom, because a lot of Jews were coming to Tel Aviv in the 1930s. Some of them, most of them, were fleeing Nazi Germany. And Tel Aviv needed to construct a lot of homes for them. So Tel Aviv needed a lot of architects. And some of them were, amazingly, women. Not too many of them. And one of them was Genia Averbuch. She was only 25 when she won the municipal competition to design the square, and she designed it in the international style. Now, this is important to understand what we wanted to refer to when we said that this tour is called the White City Ladies. So what is the international style? All the buildings around the square, I'm going to grab a better picture for you to see the buildings around the square. So all the buildings around the square were designed in the international style that is also called from time to time Bauhaus. This is not a curse in German. It is the name of the German school in which the international style that you see a nice example of right behind me, of which you see a nice. I was told to never end with a proposition. That's why I never got married. So you see here that the example of the international style building behind me is characterized by clean lines. It is very simple. It has long balconies, which is very functional for a city that is very hot during the summer. And remember, in the 1930s, we still don't have air conditioning. So this is the international style. And more than 1,000 buildings were built in this style and were preserved in Tel Aviv. In 2003, UNESCO, the United Nations organization that is responsible for culture, designated the White City of Tel Aviv. This is what we call those buildings that were built in the international style. So UNESCO designated the White City of Tel Aviv as a World Heritage Site. And since then, Tel Aviv is celebrating what is called the White Night every year in the summer. We celebrate the White Night in Tel Aviv, not this year though, to commemorate the UNESCO declaration of the White City as a World Heritage Site. Okay, stopping for a second to see what you guys are writing to me in the chat. I'm sorry that I can't do this as live as possible, but I'm going through what people are writing. Okay, so could you discuss the population growth in Tel Aviv since its founding? Calvin is asking. Well, this is interesting. Up until First World War, that is 1914, so Tel Aviv is just a small village, suburb of Jaffa. In the 1920s, when the British come to the land of Israel, they make Tel Aviv into its own municipality. This is what is starting the independence of Tel Aviv as a different city, as a unique city that is different from Jaffa. And this allows for Tel Aviv to grow very rapidly. A lot of people are coming. There are a few waves of aliyah to Israel in the 1920s, mostly from Poland and Russia, and in the 1930s from Germany. And after the establishment of the State of Israel, or the eve of the establishment of the State of Israel, Tel Aviv is about 200, even 250,000 strong, which is amazing because it was more than a third of all of the Jewish population in the land of Israel in 1948. Okay, Gail is asking, at the end, can you please write the names of these women you are discussing? So I don't think that I will write all the names because it's so many women to talk about. But as I mentioned earlier, you can visit the 360 tour that has all the information that I'm talking about and also has the names of all of the women that I'm talking about, have talked about, will talk about. So many verbs you get there in English. It's your language. I'm just trying to use it, you know. Walter Gropius was one of the founders of the Bauhaus. Did he ever come to Tel Aviv? Interesting. I don't think so, but it is worth researching. There were very few people who actually learned at the Bauhaus school in Germany and then came to the land of Israel. From hundreds of architects that were working in Tel Aviv and built buildings in the international style, only 4 actually went to the Bauhaus school. And the Harvard Art Museum has the largest collection of Bauhaus art. Robert mentions. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everybody, for writing. Let's continue our tour. We are now going to skew a little to what is the back of the square, of Dizengoff Square. We're going to go on Zamenhof Street to a small garden, a small playground, you might say, that is not far away from the busy street of Dizengoff. This is what makes Tel Aviv unique, that you have these pockets of greenery so close to the middle of the city. So this place, why is it connected to our feminist tour? Around us, there are 4 streets. One of them is called Ruth. This is what gave this playground the name Ruth Playground. Another street that is on the other side of mine, this is called Yael Street. There is also Shulamit Street on another side of me, and also Esther Street. So if I were an alien landing in this place in Tel Aviv, I would look around me and I will see 4 streets all named after women. I would imagine that there's nothing to say. 100% of the streets in Tel Aviv are named after women, but actually that's not the case. Write to me in the chat box right now in the chat box if you're keen on guessing. Write to me what you think. What is the percentage of streets that are named after women? There are thousands of streets in Tel Aviv. I think 2,500, something like this. And tell me, what do you think is the percentage? How many streets are named after women? Write to me in the chat. Feel free to do so. There's no test at the end of it, so don't worry. If you guess wrong, it's okay. So remember, women are 50%, a little bit more even, 50% of the population. What say you? What is the percentage of streets that are named after women in Tel Aviv? Sherry is saying 33%. 50% says Jonathan. Ron is guessing 17. 12, 5, 10%. 30, 10, 20, 12. So the closest was Leslie with 5%, because just a little bit more than 2% of streets in Tel Aviv are named after women, which is amazing. can I please make this the center of the? Thank you for suggesting. I will spotlight my my view. I think it is in the spotlight. Let me see if I can make
You
sure of
are
this.
you are the spotlight.
Ah, okay, fantastic. So now I think I'm.
It
I think
might
that the
be a setting on Heidi. It might be a setting that you need to make in your gallery view.
yeah. So change it
Yeah,
from gallery view to speaker view, and you'll be able to
yeah.
see me.
Heidi, you need to change your setting. Yeah.
On the big screen. So less than 3% of the streets in Tel Aviv are named after women, and this is the exception. And think about it, what is similar? What is similar between Ruth, Yael, Shulamit, and Esther? They are all women, of course. They are all biblical characters. And another interesting thing is that the municipal committee for naming streets in Tel Aviv back in the 1920s, when they were thinking, the members of the committee, they were thinking about who are the women that should get streets named after them in Tel Aviv. They only thought of biblical characters, and specifically, they thought about Ruth, Yael, Esther, and Shulamit. They were all known for not just being heroines in the Bible, but also for alluring men. So they all had this important um, trademark that they use their sexuality in a sense to allure men, and this is what the people in Tel Aviv in the 1920s are thinking, that these are the women characters to aspire to look up to. Okay, so this was our fourth stop. We're now going to go around the corner. Around the corner is a house that was also designed by a woman architect like Jenja Averbuch. The name of the architect who designed this building is Elza Gidoni. Elza Gidoni was one of the first women to study architecture in a European university in the 1920s, and she came to the land of Israel and she wanted to excel in being an architect. She designed a lot of buildings that were residential buildings, but actually she got more work from women organizations at the time. For some reason she didn't get a lot of work. Maybe it was because she was a woman architect. She felt she was not celebrated. She was not very well recognized for her work, and eventually she chose to leave Tel Aviv. She left for the United States, and she had a really big career in America. She designed a lot of buildings in New York and in Washington, D.C., and she was later mentioned in a Time magazine list of 100 most important women architects in America. So Tel Aviv lost her in a sense. So she left us a little bit of this. Later, one of the researchers of women architects in Tel Aviv, her name is Sigal Davidi, she wanted to know how come the women architects weren't as remembered, because nobody, if you walk the streets of Tel Aviv, nobody knows about Elza Gidoni Mendelstam, nobody knows about Jenja Averbuch, and that's a shame. The reason is, and Sigal Davidi, the researcher, is saying that the reason is that most women at the time weren't able to find the balance between a career and a family. Now, this is interesting because if you are a man and you're an architect, you can have a career and still have a family, because your wife is going to, I'm talking about 1930s Tel Aviv, because your wife will be able to raise the kids. And then those kids will keep the archive and will make sure that you will be remembered. They will bring the documents that you created as an architect to museums. They will have retrospect for your works. So that's why men architects were able to create a career and also have a family that later took it up to them to look at your commemoration. But women architects didn't have this privilege, because they weren't able to just shove aside the raising kids thing on the man that was living with them, because it wasn't the custom at the time. So that's why a lot of women architects didn't marry, didn't have kids, and eventually there was no one to remember them and commemorate them and make sure that their archive will be given to researchers to investigate further into their works. So Oni Mandelstam. And another important woman that created the white city of Tel Aviv. Now we're going to walk on this street. The street that we are now on is called Rhine Street. This is important. We're going to go to not far from Elsa's house to the next corner, which is the corner of Frischmann and Reines. And you can see behind me this place. This is called the House of Doctors. This is interesting because something gets lost in translation when you say it in English. In Hebrew, we look at this sign and we say Bet HaRofim. Bet HaRofim means the house of men doctors or men physicians. So there's a famous woman poet in Israel. Her name is Yona Volach, and she wrote about the Hebrew language that it is sex maniacal. It always wants to know the sex of the person that is talking. So you have this differentiation in Hebrew between men and women, and here saying the house of men doctors is very it has a little bit of a problem in it. That is what Yona Volach is saying, because the Hebrew language isn't neutral. Like a kid that is walking down the street, a woman. Again, I have no words for it in English. So a young woman, for example, will be looking at this inscription and she will say to herself, this is the house of men doctors. So what is my place in the public sphere if this is the house of men doctors? And there are a lot of women in this building. A lot of women physicians now are working in this building, and it is still called the house of men doctors because that's just how the Hebrew language is going. And there is actually an interesting wave of feminists in Israel that are saying that we should try and relax the rules of the Hebrew language to facilitate for more women to be a part of the public sphere in Israel, in Hebrew culture. Okay, we're going to walk further out on Rhine Street in this direction to get to another important place in Tel Aviv. It is the place that is the most Jerusalem-like looking building in Tel Aviv. So you see over my left shoulder, this is this building. You see that it has a Jerusalem stone cover on it. I'm not sure who had this idea, but it's very unique. You don't see a lot of that in Tel Aviv. So this place is important because it was the first public housing project to be built in Tel Aviv. As we said, in 1930s Tel Aviv, I see that Sigal that I just mentioned is coming into our session. So this house, the house that is looking the most like the Jerusalem building, it was the first public project housing, the first public housing project in Tel Aviv. As we said, in 1930s Tel Aviv, a lot of people need housing, and the municipality decides to build something that is going to be for people who need housing tremendously. This was the first project that they built to give to people who needed housing. And who are the first people to receive apartments in this building? Of course, the administrators in the municipality itself. So they get the first apartments in here. And also one of them was Israel Rokach, later to become the mayor of Tel Aviv. And he also got an apartment in this building. I wanted to mention it because he gave the apartment that he had here to his secretary, Tova Goldberg Ariel. And later her kid, Gideon, he wrote a memoir in which he tells the story that one time Mayor Israel Rokach came to visit them in the apartment that they received, and he gave Gideon a toy and he asked him to go play outside. Gideon made it sound like he was leaving the apartment, but actually got into a cabinet and hid. And what he saw was happening between Israel Rokach and his secretary, you can read in his memoir, or imagine right now. So we're walking up Rhinus Street to our next destination. We're going to the intersection of Rhinus and Gordon. And this is the point in time that I want to mention the ficus trees behind me. So you see these giant ficus trees that were planted in Tel Aviv to make a lot of shade. They are also showcasing, I'm using them to say something that I think is important about feminism. You see on one side, the streets are very high. They go, 3-4 stories high. And on the other side, they are much smaller. When I ask people walking up Rhine Street, why are the trees on one side bigger than on the other side? Some people will think maybe they're not getting enough shade, maybe they're getting too much sunshine, maybe there is something that they're not doing right that makes it so that the trees aren't growing as they should have grown. The reason is actually that there are these electricity lines ahead, up above our heads, and every few months the electricity company comes and takes and trims the trees on one side to make sure that they don't damage the electricity lines. And this is something that I used to talk about what is called in feminist literature the glass ceiling. So you might have heard the term glass ceiling. It is something that is stopping women from advancing, and you can't really see it. That's why it's called a glass ceiling. So sometimes you don't have strict rules that are prohibiting women from going further, from advancing in their career, but there are some almost transparent laws that don't make it happen. And this is something that can be used to articulate this idea of a glass ceiling and this feminist concept that is very important for anybody to realize. So these were the ficus trees. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that the street that I'm standing on, which I also said earlier, this is Rhinus Street. It is running parallel to the main street here called Dizengoff Street. And this is important because back in the 1950s, Dizengoff Street was the place to go and have fun. It was filled with cafes, restaurants, movie theaters. So if you were a young man going on a date and you wanted to show off your date, you would go on Dizengoff Street. But if you weren't so keen on showing off your date, some of the young men would choose to go on Rhinus Street. And this what created a Hebrew term called Rhinus girls. Now, if you look in the Hebrew slang dictionary, you will see the term Rhinus girls, and the definition is, and I'm just citing it. It's Rhinus girl is an ugly girl that one is ashamed to go on Dizengoff Street with. So this is the chauvinist slur that was used in the 1950s. Today, saying Rhinus girl, most people in Tel Aviv wouldn't know what you're talking about. But I'm taking you on Rhinus Street not because you are Rhinus girls. We're just trying to rediscover women who worked and made Tel Aviv into what it is. So we're going around the corner to Gordon Street, and we're going to reach this house that is on 49 Gordon Street. This is very important for me to tell you about because I have a personal connection here. So I'm showing you my screen again to show you a work of art by Hagit Lalo. Hagit Lalo and her sister Nitza Sivan used to live in the house that is behind me on 49 Gordon Street. They were the daughters of Bracha Streit. Bracha Streit was in the 1920s one of the first women in the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel to fight for women's suffrage. So you see that feminism is running in the genes here. So Hagit Lalo and Nitza Sivan, they both studied in the United States in the 1950s. That's how they got their higher education. Very unique for young women in the 1950s in Tel Aviv, in Israel, to get their education in the States, but they got it. And when they came back, they were not well received. For example, Hagit, I'm showing you some of her works of art. She became an artist. She brought what is known as expressionism, modern expressionism, to Israel, and it wasn't well received. Actually, it was so badly received that when she was 30 years old, she decided to take her own life in this house that I'm standing outside of, just because she wasn't allowed, she wasn't able to go further with her career and become a famous artist. Her sister, Nitza Sivan, she was a secretary, but her passion was writing poems for children. No publish house was approving of that. No publish house wanted to publish her book of poems. So eventually she did it on her own. And that's how she got this book printed. It's called Nitzanei Shir by Nitza Sivan. So this is the book of poems by Nitza Sivan. And why I'm telling you about them, I'm telling you about Hagit and Nitza because this is a story that should be told about the women who didn't come to prominence, and maybe not rightly so. And another reason is that Nitza Sivan is my grandmother, and she was kind of a hero in my eyes because she was also raising my mother here in Tel Aviv when she was a kid. She was one of the only women to raise a kid, at the time in the 1950s in Tel Aviv. It was very unique to be a single mother, and she did it anyway. And you can't have a feminist tour in Tel Aviv without mentioning your mother, right? So might as well. So I see that some questions are being raised. I'm going to refer to, okay, so Sharon is asking, how has COVID-19 impacted Tel Aviv and daily life? Just to answer shortly, because we want to get to our last stop and then go to the fun quiz that we have at the end. Tel Aviv was completely shut down for 2 whole months from the middle of March to the middle of May. It is now suspected of having a second wave of COVID-19 outbreak. So maybe we're going to go back on some of the things that were allowed in recent weeks. Hopefully not, but maybe we will. We're seeing a rise in the number of people who are falling ill to COVID-19. Sherry is asking, do you think it was related to her being a woman? So you can't know, but you can't help but wonder. I'm not sure. Maybe we'll never know. Sal is mentioning that we now have a new head of the Knesset Committee for the Advancement of Women and Gender Equality, and that head is Oded Forer of Israel Beitenu, who is a man, which some people find to be ironic. Okay, our last destination, our last stop in our tour is going to be this place behind me. It is called Hannah's house. Hannah was a pioneer in the land of Israel in the beginning of the 20th century. You see her at the top of this group. She became a pioneer in the beginning of the 20th century, next to the Sea of Galilee in what was then known as the Damsel's Farm. Actually, one of the famous young women who came to study agriculture at that farm is called Rachel Blufstein. She became the woman national poet of Israel, very well known today in Israel. So she became a pioneer, and she copied the idea of a woman's farm to Tel Aviv. And what was here behind me only about 100 years ago was what you see now on your screen, which is an agricultural farm at the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Up until the 1930s, when Tel Aviv started to grow very rapidly and kind of engulfed all of the farm that used to be here. Now it is the center of Tel Aviv. Everything was built on top of the lands that used to be the farm by that was headed by Chana Chizik, one of the first pioneers. And Sherry is saying that nobody is smiling in the picture of the women. That's true. Maybe because it was so hard to get your picture taken at the time. And I'm gonna skip right ahead to the quiz that we have right now. We have 10 questions, and as we did last time, we're going to end our virtual tour in the footsteps of prominent women in Tel Aviv. We have a fun quiz. We have 10 questions. You will see them on your screen. I'm going to read them out loud, and we're going to start right now. So on your screen right now, you'll be able to see the first question. Sometimes you'll have to guess some of the things we've talked about in the tour. Let's start. First question. You see now on your screen, women's suffrage in the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel was granted in 1920, 1925, 1931, or 1944. We mentioned Bracha Streit, the mother of Nitza Sivan and Chagit Lavo, my great-grandmother, in fact. So she fought for women's suffrage in the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel before it became popular. So what year was women's suffrage granted in the land of Israel? Let's see, what say you? And most of you are saying that it is 1920. Showing you the results now on your screen. Most of you are saying that it is 1925. Actually, women's suffrage in the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel was granted already in 1920. Just after the establishment of the British Mandate, there was an election for the Jewish, what became kind of a legislative body, and already at the first round of elections, women were granted suffrage, not without a fight, might I say. But it is amazing that already in the beginning of the Zionist movement, the Zionist Congress, headed by Herzl, gave or granted women's suffrage already from the Second Congress. I think it was 1898. So even before there was a Jewish state, women were enjoying women's suffrage. So, second question, now appearing on your screen. Where was the first Bet Tzirot Mizrahi established? We started at Bet Tzirot Mizrahi in Tel Aviv. I saw that some of you wrote to me in the chat about that. Where was the first Bet Tzirot Mizrahi established? We said that Bessie Gottesfeld, the head of the women's Mizrahi movement in America, she made sure that that building will be established. It was the second Bet Tzirot Mizrahi in the land of Israel. Where was the first? So the question is on your screen for quite a while. Let's see what you are saying. Ending the polling right now and showing you the results on your screen. Most of you are saying that the first Bet Tzirot Mizrahi house was in Jerusalem, and you are correct. The majority is correct. The first Bet Tzirot Mizrahi was in Jerusalem. The second one was in Tel Aviv. Going for question number 3. So you're seeing it on your screen right now. Which Israel Prize recipient was honored posthumously? Which Israel Prize recipient was honored posthumously? That means after her death. Which Israel Prize recipient was honored posthumously? We said that Chana Rovina received the Israel Prize for theater. Leah Goldberg received the Israel Prize for literature. Gertrude Kraus received the Israel Prize for choreography, and Yafa Elkoni received the Israel Prize for singing. Who of them received the prize only after her death? Let's see what you're saying. Okay, ending the poll right now and showing you the results. Most of you are saying that Gertrude Krause received the Israel Prize posthumously, but actually it was Leah Goldberg. An interesting fact about the Israel Prize is that it is not given to people who have passed away, but in the special case of Leah Goldberg, she was honored with the Israel Prize, and between the time that she was told that she is going to receive the prize and until the ceremony itself, she unfortunately passed away. So her mother actually went and got the prize for her. She was an interesting figure, her mother. When she passed away, on her tombstone, she asked that only the phrase "Mother of Leah Goldberg" will be written on her tombstone. Interesting connection there was there. Okay, now going to our fourth question. You will now be able to see it on your screen. Architect Elza Gidoni Mendelstam designed buildings for which organizations? That's a multiple choice question, so you can choose several organizations that you know, that you might guess are some of the organizations that Elza worked with. So which organizations you think Elza Gidoni Mendelstam designed buildings for? Was it the Mizrahi Women's Organization of America? Was it WITO, Women's International Zionist Organization? Was it Women's League of Israel, also called LENI in Hebrew? Or AMIT, Americans for Israel and Torah? What do you think? Okay, ending the poll right now and showing you the results. Okay, so most of you are thinking that it was the Mizrahi Women's Organization of America and also WITO. So as we said, Elza Gidoni Mendelstam designed several houses in Tel Aviv, but most of her works were commissioned by women's organizations. The women's organizations were WITO and the Women's League of Israel. Mizrahi movement, she didn't work with them, and the Mizrahi movement, the Mizrahi Women's Organization of America, later became AMIT, Americans for Israel and Torah. So the right answers are WITO and Women's League for Israel. A lot of women's organization in this Zionist movement, right? Okay, launching our fifth question. What was Tzina Dizengoff's profession? We said that she was the first modern woman to have a street named after her in Tel Aviv. First woman to have a square named after her in Tel Aviv. She was the first lady of Tel Aviv, the wife of Mayor Dizengoff. What was her profession? What did she do when she wasn't the wife of the first mayor? What did she do for a career? Was she a fashion designer? Was she an electrician? Was she a French teacher? Or was she an artist? Okay, we are going to shortly end the poll and show you the results. What say you? What was Tzina Dizengoff's profession? Most of you are saying fashion designer. Actually, the right answer is French teacher. She taught French. Interesting. I think that because I said that she was very elegantly dressed, most of you guessed that she was a fashion designer. She was also an art enthusiast. That's why I wrote an artist there. And she was also the first person in Tel Aviv to sign an electricity bill. She was the first client of the electricity company in Israel. That's why I wrote down electrician. But as we said, correct answer is French teacher. Okay. We have now moved to our second phase of the quiz. Last 5 questions. 5 last questions. You are now seeing on your screen question number 6. Who brought the ficus trees to the land of Israel? Were the British? Were the Ottomans? Maybe the Jews, or maybe it was the Arabs. Who brought the ficus trees to the land of Israel? You remember the trees that I used to articulate the notion of glass ceiling, very important feminist concept. during our virtual tour. So who brought the ficus trees to the land of Israel and specifically to Tel Aviv? What say you? Was it the British after they came to the land of Israel in 1917? Was it the Ottomans? The Ottoman Empire ruled the land of Israel from the middle of the 15th century up until 1917. Was it the Jews that came here in the 19th century, or the Arabs? What say you? Okay, ending the poll right now, sharing you the results. So most of you are thinking that both the British and the Ottomans brought the ficus trees to the land of Israel, but there's only one correct answer, and the right answer is the British. When they came to Tel Aviv, to Israel in 1917, they were very hot. They have better weather in Britain, so they brought trees from India. These ficus trees that they planted in Tel Aviv. Today, the Tel Aviv municipality is cursing the British for that because they make a lot of mess, but I love the ficus trees altogether because they create so much shade, which is very important. Okay. Interesting question on your screen right now. Who was the first modern woman to have a street in Tel Aviv named after her? Who was the first modern woman to have a street in Tel Aviv named after her? Was it Henrietta Sold? Was it Golda Meir? Was it Sarah Aronson or Hannah Senesh? Henrietta Sold, one of the heads of the WITO movement. Golda Meir, also an important leader in the Zionist movement and later Prime Minister of Israel. Sarah Aronson, known as the first spy in the Jewish settlement in Israel. And Hannah Senesh, one of the women who volunteered to the British Army and then landed in Europe during World War II. What say you? Ending the poll right now, sharing the result, and the majority are saying that Henrietta Sold is the first modern woman to have a street named after her in Tel Aviv. And you are correct. It was Henrietta Sold. And when you look at the geography of Tel Aviv, you see that the street is a little further away from the city center. So a lot of streets were built, and for a lot of time, we waited for a street to be named after a woman until Henrietta Sold received that honor. So now we're going to our last three questions. Question number 8, now on your screen. If I say Rhinus Girls today in Israel, what will people think I mean? Is it 1950s chauvinistic slang? An Israeli rock band? A radical feminist movement in Tel Aviv, or a famous work of art shown in Israel Museum in Jerusalem? What say you? If I say Rhinus Girls today in Israel, what would people think I mean? 1950s chauvinist slang, an Israeli rock band, a radical feminist movement in Tel Aviv, or a famous work of art shown in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem? Ending the poll right now, showing you the results. Most of you are saying 1950s chauvinistic slang. That is true that this is what appears in the Hebrew slang, but apart from me and you guys now, most people don't know the term Rhinus Girls as a chauvinistic slang, thankfully. Most people in Israel today would say Rhinus Girls as the name of an Israeli rock band, which is cool. Stopping sharing you the results and going to question number 9, one before last. This is a multiple choice question. Who was or who is depicted on Israeli banknotes? Was it Henrietta Sod? Was it Golda Meir? Leah Goldberg or Rachel Bluvstein? So Henrietta Sod we already mentioned, also Golda Meir. Leah Goldberg we also saw in our tour, and Rachel Bluvstein, I mentioned her as one of the women to study agriculture in the Damsels Farm next to Sea of Galilee, and she became a famous poet in the land of Israel in the 1920s and 1930s. And there's actually a street named after her right behind this building that I'm standing next to. So it's a multiple choice question, so you can guess more than one. Henrietta Sod, Golda Meir, Leah Goldberg, or Rachel Bluvstein. What say you? Ending the poll right now and showing you what you are thinking. So most of you think that Golda Meir showed on Israeli banknotes, and you are correct. Next up, Henrietta Sold also appeared on Israeli shekel banknotes. And let me surprise you. Today on Israeli shekel banknotes, you see Leah Goldberg and Rachel Blufstein. So all of the women that I mentioned in this question, they are all depicted or used to be depicted on Israeli banknotes. And another interesting thing is that they are the only ones. So from about 32 characters that appeared on Israeli banknotes from 1948 to now, only 4 were women. And interestingly enough, Golda Meir is the only one that had kids. The rest had no kids. They never had kids. Okay, going to our last question. Question number 10, now on your screen. Where was Chagit Lalo commemorated? You remember Chagit Lalo, the artist, my mother's aunt also. Chagit Lalo Street in Tel Aviv, is she commemorated at the Tel Aviv Art Museum foyer? Maybe a square named after her in Petah Tikva? Or is she commemorated nowhere? What say you? Where was Chagit Lalo commemorated? In a street in Tel Aviv, in the Tel Aviv Art Museum. Maybe a square was named after her in Petah Tikva, which is the town where she grew up, where she was born and raised. Or is she commemorated nowhere? Okay, stopping the poll right now and showing you what you guys are thinking. Sharing the results right now. Most of you are thinking that Chagit Lalo was commemorated nowhere. And this used to be true, but thankfully my family helped and made sure that you will be commemorated at the Tel Aviv Art Museum foyer. So now when you come to the Tel Aviv Art Museum and you enter the lobby, you will see a staircase, kind of staircase that is going up. That staircase is now called Chagit Lalo Ascend. Okay, just to complete, I want to show you again the virtual tour that I started with, the 360 virtual tour that you can do on your own, that you can see on my website. So you now see my website that is called TLVXP, and once you click the English section, you'll be able to scroll and see the Feminist virtual tour in Tel Aviv as a 360 do it on your own virtual tour, and you can put it up on the big screen and use the mouse to look all around and also get some more information and learn about all of the women that we talked about. And I hope you enjoyed this tour as much as I did. Okay, giving the mic back to either Adi or Karen. Thank you guys for writing down thank you in the chat box.
Thank you, Tomel. That was so wonderful. Once again, we really appreciate the tour. We appreciate you coming on at the late hour that it is in Israel right now. We know you are 7 hours ahead. I speak for all of us at the BZD, all of us in the Baltimore community, saying thank you and really appreciating this. And I hope that one day in the near future, maybe we can all take a real tour with you in Israel and get to meet you and do a tour of Tel Aviv with you in person. I know that that would be great for all of us here in Baltimore to come and see you. So we really thank you, and we hope to see you live in Tel Aviv and do one of your tours in person. I wanted to thank each of you for joining us today. Just a reminder and perhaps an alert that this Sunday, the 14th at 7 p.m., we have the cast of 2 members of the cast of Unorthodox joining us live on Zoom. It is Esty. If you saw the show Unorthodox, it will be Esty's aunt and her father who are on the show. I don't have their exact names on hand, but Adi will be leading a moderated discussion with the cast, which should be a very interesting discussion. If you have questions for the cast, we would love to have your questions answered. You can email those questions to me in advance. I'm going to put my email in the chat right now. and I would love to ask those questions for you in the moderated discussion. That will be at 7 p.m. on Sunday, the 14th. We would love to see you all there. The email comes out. If you get the emails from BZD, that email came out for registrations already. If you don't get the emails from BZD, please make sure that you email me with your email address so we can add you to those emails. Next Tuesday at 11 a.m., same time, we are doing a virtual tour of the Ben Gurion House, which is also in Tel Aviv. That will be a live tour and should be extremely interesting to watch, so we hope you will join us for that. The information and registration for that is also in the emails that we send out on Thursday, so make sure you get our emails. Again, if not, please send me an email so we can add you to our email blast. I think that's it for us for today. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you have a great day. We learned a lot. I know I learned a lot. Thank you, Tomer, again. Tomer's email is, his website, sorry, is on the chat. Any other information will be on his website. And thank you again for joining us. I'm going to unmute everybody just so that you guys can say thank you and your goodbyes, and here we go.
Let's do our selfie again.
Yes,
you guys want to do a
quick
selfie?
Thank you.
This is the point in time if you want to do a selfie together, you
Yes.
can wave. You can also open up your camera. This is a really cool thing to do. Okay, 1, 2, 3, be ready?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys, it was fantastic. Thank you for having me. And hopefully we'll meet in person in the future.
Yes, I hope so.
תודה רבה, תומר.
תודה לכם.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
Say again.